Kansas, the sprawling heartland of America, where fields stretch endlessly under a wide, open sky, and the towns sit like silent sentinels in the distance. The roads wind their way across the flat land, long and unbroken, giving a sense of solitude and peace. At least, that's the illusion. To the outsider, Kansas might seem like an idyllic place, the kind of land where nothing bad could ever happen. It's quiet, with the soft rustling of the wind through the crops and the occasional crow's call breaking the silence. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and the sun sets gently over the horizon, casting golden light over the fields. But that peace, that calm, hides something darker than most could ever imagine. Something ancient, buried beneath the surface of the land, in the shadows of those fields, and in the empty corners of the small, sleepy towns that dot the landscape. The locals know. They don't speak about it, but they know. Some things are better left unsaid, they say. Some things are too dangerous to remember, to even acknowledge. The story starts back in the 1800s, when the small town of Creek Hollow, nestled deep within the Kansas plains, was still a place where farmers tended to their crops, where children played in the dirt, and the townsfolk gathered in the local tavern for stories and gossip. But as it often happens with small towns, there are secrets hidden behind every door, and sometimes those secrets are more dangerous than anyone could ever guess. It was in this town that the first whispers of the Bloodbound began. No one really knows when it started or how, but the first mention of them came from a girl named Sarah. She was young, naive, just starting to grow into a woman. Her family was one of the wealthier ones in Creek Hollow, their farm sprawling far and wide across the land. She had long, golden hair that shone in the sunlight, and bright blue eyes that never seemed to stop looking at the world around her, filled with curiosity. But that curiosity would be her undoing. It was said that Sarah, after overhearing hushed conversations one night at her father's farm, became fascinated with the strange group that seemed to lurk on the outskirts of the town. They weren't like the rest of the townspeople. They were secretive. Their gatherings always shrouded in mystery, hidden away from the eyes of the public. Some said they were just another religious sect, a strange cult that practiced ancient rites. Others claimed they were something far more sinister. But whatever they were, they attracted Sarah's attention. She began to sneak away at night, following the shadows that seemed to dance in the distance. At first, it was just a curiosity. What were they doing in the woods? Why did they meet there at the old barn at the edge of town so late at night? What could they possibly be up to in that dark, decrepit place? It didn't take long for Sarah to find out. The night she disappeared, the last thing anyone heard from her was a faint scream, a quick, sharp sound that was cut off too abruptly. Her father, hearing it from the field where he worked late into the night, rushed towards the barn. But by the time he got there, there was nothing. No sign of his daughter. No body. Just blood. Blood stains on the ground, leading from the barn to the woods beyond. That was the only trace Sarah left behind. And that blood was enough to send a chill down the spine of anyone who saw it. But it wasn't just the blood. It was what came after. The town searched high and low for her, but it was as if the earth itself had swallowed her whole. The sheriff scoured the area, combed the woods, checked the nearby farms. Nothing. Sarah was gone, and with her, the first sign of the creeping death. A people of Creek Hollow spoke in hushed voices about what happened to Sarah. Some said she was taken by the cult, dragged into the darkness to be a sacrifice. Others claimed that the creeping death had come for her, that shadow that moved without sound, that took the innocent, the curious, and those who wandered too close to the truth that no one dared to speak. The Bloodbound were no ordinary cult. They believed in the power of blood, of life and death. They practiced rituals that were said to bend fate itself, allowing them to control not just the lives of others, but the very forces that governed life and death. The belief was that by spilling blood, by making sacrifices to an unknown power, they could gain control over everything. Life, luck, and even the souls of the living. They believed that the more blood they shed, the more powerful they became. And Sarah, innocent as she was, had become their first offering. The creeping death wasn't just a legend. It was something real, something that followed the rituals, that fed off the sacrifices made by the Bloodbound. It moved silently, like a shadow, and it didn't just take lives, it took souls. But it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The creeping death didn't stop with Sarah. The Bloodbound continued their rituals in secret, hidden away from the prying eyes of the townsfolk. They believed they were invincible, that they could control death itself, but they were wrong, and that mistake would cost them. As the years went on, the town of Creek Hollow changed. People moved away. New families came in, unaware of the history that lay buried beneath their feet. But the land, the blood-soaked earth, never forgot. The whispers didn't die. They only grew louder. The shadows that haunted the old barn, the woods and the fields, they were still there, waiting. And the creeping death still moved in the darkness, silently claiming anyone who wandered too close to the truth. For some, the past was best forgotten. But for others, the curse of Creek Hollow was something that could never be erased, no matter how hard they tried. And as for Sarah, her story, her blood, was the beginning of something much darker. Something that would come back to haunt Kansas forever. The 1960s were a time of change, but in the small town of Creek Hollow, little had changed since the dark days of Sarah's disappearance. The town was quieter now, a far cry from the whispers that had once echoed in the streets about the mysterious cult and the creeping death. Life moved on as it always did in small towns, where old stories were just that, stories. As decades passed, the chilling events of the 1800s began to fade from memory. Their place taken by new concerns, new faces, and the quiet hum of suburban life. But the past has a way of returning, even when no one is looking. The Bloodbound, though almost forgotten, were never truly gone. They had gone deeper underground, slipping into the shadows, their rituals and sacrifices continuing in silence. And the creeping death, the force that had haunted the town for generations, had never stopped feeding. It began with rumors. At first they were just that, rumors. People started to notice strange things in the woods that bordered the town, figures that moved just out of sight, glimpses of shadowed forms darting between the trees at night. Sometimes they'd hear noises, soft whispers on the wind, rustling leaves, as though the forest itself was alive, aware of the eyes that lingered near its edges. A faint scream on the breeze, or a strange echo in the dark. But it wasn't just the noises. People started to disappear. Not everyone, of course, but enough that the town began to take notice. At first it was a child, a boy who wandered too far into the woods. His parents, frantic with worry, searched the forest for days, but there was no trace of him. No sign of struggle, no footprints. He simply vanished, like mist evaporating in the morning sun. Then there was Jacob. He was just an ordinary man, a farmer who had lived in Creek Hollow all his life. He was well known in the town, a friendly face who often helped his neighbors with their crops. But one night, Jacob left his house on a whim. He heard something strange in the woods. A sound that didn't belong to the usual wildlife that roamed the forests. A whisper, a rustle, maybe a footstep in the dark. It piqued his curiosity, as such things often do. Jacob wasn't the kind of man to be easily frightened. But this felt different. It wasn't the wind, or an animal, or even another person. No, it felt wrong. And so, with the moon high in the sky and the night thick around him, he ventured into the woods. He carried only a lantern and his sense of courage. The farther he walked, the more he felt the air grow thick with something he couldn't quite place, a weight pressing down on him, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Jacob didn't come back that night, or the next, and his wife Clara was left to wonder where he had gone, what had happened to him, and why he hadn't returned. Days turned into weeks, and the search for Jacob grew more desperate. The whole town came together to scour the woods, to retrace Jacob's steps. They searched high and low, combing through the underbrush, calling his name into the silence. But there was no sign of him. The forest was quiet, too quiet. Weeks passed, and the police investigation stalled. There were no clues, no leads, and no explanations. Jacob had simply vanished. as though he had been swallowed whole by the earth itself. The sheriff, an old man named Bill, could only offer his condolences and suggest that maybe Jacob had wandered off, that maybe he'd gotten lost. But Clara knew, deep in her heart, that something far more sinister was at work. Then, one day, Clara couldn't take it anymore. She needed answers. She couldn't just sit by, waiting for a man who might never come home. And so, despite the warnings from her neighbors and the growing sense of dread that filled the air, Clara set out into the woods herself. She knew the forest better than anyone. It was a place she had wandered through many times with Jacob, a place where the two of them had spent countless hours. But now it felt different. It felt as though the trees themselves were watching her, their twisted branches like fingers reaching out from the darkness. She walked for hours, the cool breeze rustling through the leaves, her breath coming in soft puffs. The deeper she went, the heavier the air became. The forest was silent now, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she pressed on, her lantern flickering weakly in the darkening woods. She saw something, a figure in the distance, just out of reach of the light. She called out, but there was no response. She called again, her voice trembling in the still air. And that's when she found it. The cave. It wasn't much of a cave, really. More of a hollow in the earth, hidden by overgrown bushes and a canopy of trees. Clara might have missed it if she hadn't been so focused on finding Jacob. The entrance was small, barely large enough to crawl through, but she could feel something tugging at her, pulling her closer, beckoning her into the darkness. Clara hesitated for a moment, her pulse racing, but her fear was overshadowed by the overwhelming need to know the truth. With a deep breath, she stepped into the cave, the lantern held high. The darkness seemed to swallow the light as she moved deeper into the earth. The walls of the cave were covered with strange symbols, scrawled in red, as though painted with blood. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp earth and something metallic, something that made her stomach turn. At the center of the cave was an altar, rough-hewn stone, stained dark with what Clara knew deep down was blood. She could feel it, the same suffocating presence that had haunted Jacob, that had called to him. The same presence that had taken him from her. Her hands shook as she placed the lantern down on the ground, the light flickering weakly against the oppressive darkness. She stepped closer to the altar, her breath shallow in her chest. And that's when she saw it. A figure in the shadows, standing still, watching her with cold, unblinking eyes. Clara's heart skipped a beat as she stepped back, fear crawling up her spine like ice. The figure moved, and in an instant, Clara turned and fled from the cave, her feet stumbling over the uneven ground, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't stop running until she reached the edge of the forest, the entrance to the town looming in the distance. But even as she ran, even as her feet hit the earth with frantic speed, Clara knew that she had seen something real. The creeping death was not just a myth. It was not a legend. It was alive, and it had been awakened, and it had claimed Jacob. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, her mind racing with the images of the cave, the altar, the figure that had watched her. She couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching her now. The creeping death had been called back into the world, and it would not stop until it had claimed more. As the years passed, the town of Creek Hollow began to change. The whispers about the Bloodbound cult and the creeping death faded into the background, pushed aside by new events and new people. But the stories never fully disappeared. The things that happened in the shadows of the Kansas plains, the blood rituals, the sacrifices, the cold, unblinking eyes of the cult's leader, lingered in the minds of those who still remembered. It was in the late 1970s that the first survivor began to speak out. His name was Lucas, and his return to Creek Hollow sent a ripple of fear and curiosity through the town. He had left years ago, just another face in the crowd, another farmer who had grown tired of the small town life. But his return was anything but ordinary. When Lucas arrived back in Creek Hollow, he was not the man who had once left. The person who came back was a shell, hollowed out by an experience that had scarred him beyond recognition. His eyes were wide, as if he had seen things that no one should ever have to see. His skin was deathly pale, like someone who had not seen the sun in years. He was gaunt, his frame thin, his voice shaky and trembling when he spoke. The moment he stepped into town, people could tell something was wrong. The townspeople who once greeted him with smiles and familiar nods now avoided his gaze. He didn't look like he belonged here anymore. The man who had once known everyone and everything about Creek Hollow now seemed like a stranger in his own home. Lucas went straight to the sheriff's office, where he asked to speak to Bill, the man who had been sheriff when Jacob disappeared. Bill was old now, his face wrinkled with the weight of years of service, but the moment he saw Lucas, a flicker of recognition passed over him. The young man, who had once been full of life, was now a hollow version of himself, a man marked by something dark, something unspeakable. "I need to tell you," Lucas said, his voice cracking, "about what happened. You need to know." Bill listened, though every part of him wanted to ignore it, to tell Lucas to go back to wherever he had been. The air in the room felt thick, with something oppressive, something that made Bill uneasy. He had heard rumors about the Bloodbound, of course, but he'd always dismissed them. They were just stories after all. Old wives' tales passed down through generations. But when Lucas spoke, when he began to recount what had happened, Bill couldn't help but feel a chill run down his spine. Lucas told Bill that he had been one of the sacrifices. He had been chosen by the cult. He had been taken to the woods, to the cave where Clara had found the altar, where the creeping death had first been unleashed. The Bloodbound had bound him with ropes, tied him to the altar, and begun their ritual, chanting in a language he couldn't understand. But he could feel the power in the air. It was thick, suffocating, pressing down on him like a weight. The smell of blood was overwhelming, and in the darkness, he could feel eyes watching him. Eyes that weren't human. As the Bloodbound prepared to sacrifice him, Lucas had fought back with everything he had. His body was bruised, broken, but he fought with a desperation he couldn't explain. He fought because he knew that if he didn't, he would die, and worse, his soul would be taken, used to fuel the ritual. The creeping death would grow stronger with every drop of blood, with every life that was sacrificed to it. Lucas wasn't about to let that happen. He told Bill how he had managed to break free from the ropes, how he had stumbled through the woods, his body nearly broken, the cold, malevolent force of the creeping death hot on his heels. It had been relentless, chasing him, pulling him back, but somehow he had managed to escape. He had run for miles, barely able to see through the tears of exhaustion, but the creeping death had been close behind. The ritual had been interrupted, but it wasn't over. Lucas had thought he had outrun it. He thought he had escaped, that he had found safety. But that was a lie. The creeping death doesn't just kill. It hunts, and it doesn't stop until it has what it wants. Bill listened, his face pale, his heart heavy with dread. He knew what Lucas was saying was true. He had seen it in the man's eyes, the same terror that had haunted the people who had disappeared all those years ago. It wasn't just death that the cult was summoning. It was something far worse. The creeping death doesn't let go, Lucas said, his voice barely above a whisper. It follows you. It hunts you. And no matter how far you run, it will always be there, waiting. It will never stop. The sheriff's office was silent as Bill absorbed what Lucas was telling him. He had to believe it, had to accept that the nightmare wasn't over. The Bloodbound were still out there, still carrying out their rituals, still feeding the creeping death. And now, Lucas had become a part of that story. His life, his soul, a piece of the puzzle. Lucas had never been the same since that night. The moment he had broken free, a part of him had been left behind in the cave, in the woods, in the grasp of the cult and the force that had come with it. He had escaped the ritual, but the creeping death had followed him. It had marked him, taken a part of him with it, and no matter where he went, no matter how far he ran, it was always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. "I'm not the same," Lucas said, his voice shaking. "I can feel it. It's always watching, always there." The people of Creek Hollow were shocked by his return, and many didn't know how to react. They listened to his story, but they didn't know what to do with it. How could they stop something like the creeping death? How could they fight a force that wasn't of this world? And more importantly, how could they survive it? The town fell silent once again, this time for good reason. The Bloodbound and the creeping death weren't just stories anymore. They weren't just whispered rumors. They were real. And the survivors who spoke of them, who had returned to tell their tales, were the proof. Lucas's warning was clear. No one truly escapes the creeping death. It may let you go for a time, but it will always find you again. No matter how far you run, no matter how fast you try to outrun it, it will always be there, waiting to claim you. The town had no choice but to face the fact that the nightmare had never truly ended. It had just been sleeping, waiting for the right moment to awaken once again. Years seemed to pass without incident, and life in Kansas returned to its familiar rhythms. The town of Creek Hollow, once shaken to its core by the horrifying events that had transpired, began to rebuild, and the whispers that had once filled the air faded into the distant past. The memories of the Bloodbound and the creeping death became nothing more than stories, passed down in hushed tones to the younger generations, who, with the innocence of youth, dismissed them as little more than urban legends. As time moved on, the fears that had once gripped the town seemed to loosen their hold, and the people of Creek Hollow began to believe that the darkness had finally been buried, that the evil that had haunted their land was nothing but a forgotten chapter of history. But deep in the heart of the woods, in the place where the old stories had started, something never stopped watching. The Bloodbound may have vanished from the town's consciousness, but they had never truly disappeared. Their ritual, their thirst for blood and power, had only gone dormant. They had waited, patiently, for the right moment to stir once more. By 2020, the world had changed dramatically. Technology had advanced, and the internet had opened up a new world of information and entertainment. The old tales of Creek Hollow, of the cursed woods and the blood rituals that had once been whispered in fear, found their way to a new generation of curious minds. Young adults, drawn to the mysteries of the past, began to search for the truth behind the urban legends that had long been buried. It started innocently enough. A group of college students, eager to experience the thrill of exploring forgotten places and testing their courage, decided to investigate the old stories of Creek Hollow. They thought it would be a fun adventure, a chance to prove to themselves that the spooky tales were nothing more than fiction. They had no idea what they were walking into. The group, 5 friends in total, set out to camp near the woods, not far from where Clara had found the hidden cave all those years ago. They came prepared with tents, flashlights, and cameras, hoping to capture the eerie atmosphere of the place on film, to share their experience with their friends online. They laughed and joked as they set up their camp, unaware that the forest around them was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. As night fell, the atmosphere around their camp began to change. The air grew colder, and the once peaceful sounds of the forest seemed to grow still. The rustling of the leaves, the chirping of the crickets, everything stopped. A silence settled over the woods, thick and oppressive, as if the world itself had held its breath. At first, the group brushed it off as nothing more than their imagination playing tricks on them. After all, they were in a forest in the middle of nowhere, and it wasn't uncommon for the sounds of nature to change as night took over. But then they started to hear something else. A whisper on the wind, faint but unmistakable. It was a soft sound, barely audible, but it seemed to come from all directions at once. They couldn't make out the words, but the tone of it made their skin crawl. It was as if the wind itself was speaking to them. A voice carried on the breeze that they could not understand, but could feel deep in their bones. One of them, a man named Ethan, stood up from where he was sitting by the campfire and squinted into the darkness. "Did you guys hear that?" he asked, his voice shaky. The others froze, straining their ears. The whispering continued, just out of reach, like a voice coming from the depths of the forest itself. At first, they told themselves it was nothing. The wind, maybe. An animal in the distance. But the whispering didn't stop. It grew louder, closer, as if something or someone was moving just beyond the trees. The group huddled together, their laughter turning to nervous glances as they realized they were not alone. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and then they saw it. Figures, shadows that moved between the trees, shifting and swaying, but never fully coming into view. At first, the group thought it was just their eyes playing tricks on them. But the more they looked, the more they realized something was out there, moving in the darkness. The figures didn't make a sound. They didn't move like animals. They were too deliberate, too purposeful, and yet they seemed to be just beyond reach. "Did you see that?" whispered Lily, her voice barely audible. Her eyes were wide with fear as she stared into the trees. Something's out there. Panic began to spread through the group as they stood, frozen in place, staring into the woods. The figures were moving again, circling them, surrounding them, but they never came close enough to be seen clearly. The shadows in the trees seemed to shift, but there was no sign of a person, no sound of footsteps. It was as if they were being stalked by something that didn't want to be seen. Something that was only watching. One by one, the group began to disappear. First, it was Ethan. He had stepped away from the campfire to investigate a noise in the distance, his curiosity getting the best of him. But when he didn't return, the others called out for him. There was no answer. They searched the area, calling his name into the night, but he was gone, completely. No trace, no sign, nothing. Panic gripped the remaining members of the group as they realized they were no longer safe. The forest around them seemed to close in, the trees growing taller, the shadows growing deeper. It felt as though the very air around them was pressing in, suffocating them. It wasn't just the fear of the unknown. It was something else, something more primal, something they couldn't understand, but knew deep in their souls was not of this world. The remaining 3 friends, desperate to find Ethan and leave the forest, stumbled across the clearing. It was there, in the heart of the woods, that they found it, the altar. The same altar Clara had seen all those years ago. But it was worse now. It was as if the ritual had already begun. The altar was covered in blood, the symbols etched into the stone glowing faintly in the dim light. And around it, there were others, figures hooded and cloaked, standing in a circle, chanting in low voices. Something more, deeper. It was there, in the heart of the woods, that they found it. Lily, unable to tear her eyes away, took a step forward, her breath catching in her throat. The air around the altar seemed to pulse with a dark energy, something malevolent that made her skin crawl. She heard the whispering, again, louder now, almost deafening, calling her name, beckoning her forward. But before she could move, she felt something behind her. Cold, icy fingers brushing against her skin. She spun around, but no one was there. The last thing she saw was the figures moving toward her, their faces hidden in shadow, their eyes gleaming with a hunger she couldn't understand. And then the world went dark. The next morning, the campsite was empty. The tents were untouched, the campfire smoldering weakly. But there was no sign of the group, no trace, no evidence of their presence. It was as if they had never existed. The creeping death had awakened once again, and the Bloodbound had returned to continue their ritual, feeding the darkness that lurked just beyond the veil of reality. The town of Creek Hollow would never be the same again. It had been forgotten for too long, but now the darkness had returned to claim what it had once lost. And it wouldn't stop until it had claimed them all. The town of Creek Hollow was no longer the quiet, peaceful place it once was. It had become a town consumed by fear, its people living in a constant state of dread. No longer could they ignore the strange happenings, the whispers in the wind, or the unexplained disappearances that had begun to plague the town once again. The creeping death was real. It was no longer a tale told around campfires, or a story passed down to scare children. The darkness had returned, and the people of Creek Hollow had no choice but to face the truth they had long avoided. The survivors, Lucas, Clara, and a handful of others, had tried to warn the town, but their warnings fell on deaf ears. The townsfolk, unable to comprehend the true horror of what they were facing, had dismissed them as just the ramblings of traumatized individuals. They couldn't understand what the creeping death was, what it meant, or how it operated. All they saw were people who had been scarred by fear and terror, struggling to make sense of what had happened to them. The townspeople were too frightened to confront the truth, too paralyzed by their own fear to take. Sheriff David, a man who had lived in Creek Hollow his entire life, couldn't stand by any longer. He knew the time had come to take action, to confront the evil that had been allowed to fester in the shadows for so long. He had heard the stories of the Bloodbound, of the disappearances, of the altar, of the whispers in the trees. But like most of the others, he had dismissed them as just that, stories. But now, with people vanishing, with the sense of something malignant and ancient stirring in the depths of the forest, he couldn't turn away. David gathered a small group of men from the town, all of them determined to face the threat head-on. They were simple farmers, hunters, and laborers, men who knew how to handle a gun, men who had grown up in the woods and knew the land as well as they knew their own hands. They were no strangers to danger, to the wildness of the Kansas plains, but this was different. This was no wild animal or storm. This was something far darker, far older, and far more terrifying. Still, they armed themselves with rifles, pistols, and any other weapon they could get their hands on. They were determined to track down the cult, to put an end to the creeping death once and for all. They ventured into the woods, following the path they had heard so much about. It led them to the old clearing, the place where Clara had found the cave, the altar, the ritual. It was a place that had been marked by blood, by sacrifice. But David and his men, driven by desperation and fear, didn't fully understand what they were walking into. The creeping death wasn't just a force of nature. It was an ancient, malevolent power that had been feeding on blood for centuries. The Bloodbound didn't just perform rituals. They were feeding it, growing it, nurturing it. They had been doing it for generations, and the forest was its home, its sanctuary. As they walked deeper into the forest, the air grew heavier. It wasn't just the weight of the trees or the darkness of the night. It was something else, something suffocating. The air felt thick, as if it were alive, pulsing with a dark energy. The wind seemed to carry something with it, a whisper, a murmur, almost too faint to catch, but it was there. And it was not the wind. It was the voice of the forest, the voice of the ritual, the voice of the creeping death. David tried to push the feeling down, trying to focus on the task at hand. They were close now. They could feel it. The altar was near, the heart of the forest's evil. He thought that if they could destroy the altar, if they could break the ritual, they could stop whatever dark force had taken root in the woods. But as they neared the clearing, the weight in the air grew even stronger, and the whispers grew louder. The forest was alive, not with animals or trees, but with the very essence of the ritual itself. It had been feeding on blood for so long, it had become part of the land. Men stopped at the edge of the clearing, their eyes falling on the altar. It was the same altar that Clara had found years ago, but now it looked different, darker. The symbols etched into the stone, glowed with a faint, otherworldly light. The air around it seemed to vibrate, as if the earth itself were trembling. The forest, the trees, the very ground they stood on was alive with energy, and David could feel it in his bones. It wasn't just dark. It was pure evil, an ancient, hungry force that had been waiting for this moment. They stepped forward, their guns raised, ready to confront whatever dark presence lay ahead. But as they moved, the figures emerged from the shadows. Figures cloaked in black, their faces hidden in shadow. They were the Bloodbound. David and his men didn't have time to react. The moment they saw the figures, they were surrounded. The air seemed to hum with dark power, and the men felt as though they were suffocating, as if the very air were pressing in on them. One of the Bloodbound stepped forward. His eyes were cold, black pits, his face hidden beneath the hood of his cloak. But David knew who he was. Ezekiel, the leader of the cult, the man who had orchestrated the rituals, who had summoned the creeping death and fed it with the blood of the innocent. Ezekiel's voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried a weight to it that made David's stomach churn. "No one ever escapes," Ezekiel said, his voice chilling. "You should have known better than to come here. The creeping death has already claimed you." David and his men raised their weapons, but it was too late. The forest seemed to come alive around them, the trees shaking as if they were reacting to the presence of the cult. The ground beneath their feet trembled. It was the power of the ritual, the ancient force that had been awakened. It had been feeding for so long that it was no longer just a spirit. It was a living, breathing entity, and it had no intention of letting anyone stop it. The last thing David saw before the darkness took him was Ezekiel's cold, black eyes staring at him with the knowledge that there was no escaping. The creeping death was unstoppable, and it had claimed them all. David and his men never returned. The town waited for them, but they never came back. The whispers in the wind grew louder. The figures in the woods began to move again, and the creeping death continued to hunt, feeding on the blood of those who dared to enter its domain. The evil in the forest had grown stronger, and no one could stop it. The Bloodbound had succeeded, and the ritual was far from over. It had only just begun. The town of Creek Hollow had become a shadow of what it once was. The once bustling streets were now eerily quiet, with only the faintest rustle of wind through the trees breaking the silence. The townspeople who had once lived their lives unaware of the darkness that lay just beyond the veil had either fled in fear or succumbed to the grip of the creeping death. The survivors were few, those who had managed to escape the horrors, or those who had been too deeply affected by the terror to remember anything of their past lives. The few who remained, the ones who had witnessed the true extent of the evil that had taken root in their town, were marked by their experiences in ways that could never be undone. Their faces were hollow, their eyes distant, haunted by memories of things they couldn't fully comprehend. They walked among the living, but their souls had long since been claimed by the darkness. There was only one truth that bound them all together. The creeping death was still out there. It was not a thing of the past, not a fading memory or a distant nightmare. No, it was alive, feeding off the fear and blood of anyone who dared to uncover its secrets. The Bloodbound had succeeded in awakening it, and now the force that had once been confined to the shadows was free, roaming the earth, its hunger unending. It had found new victims, and it would continue to do so as long as there were people foolish enough to seek the truth. The survivors who had escaped, those few who had managed to flee the grip of the creeping death, lived in constant fear. They no longer spoke to each other, no longer shared their stories. It was as if speaking of what had happened would only make it real again, would bring the horrors back into their lives. Some of them had left Creek Hollow, moving to distant towns, trying to outrun the memory of what they had seen. Others remained, but kept to themselves, too terrified to venture into the woods, too frightened to even look in the direction of the old clearing where the rituals had been performed. But the fear was always there. The creeping death never truly let go. It had touched them all, leaving an indelible mark that could never be erased. And while the town tried to move on, tried to forget, the darkness remained just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to rise again. The few survivors who had seen the true face of the creeping death knew better than anyone that there was no escaping it. They understood that once you had been touched by its power, there was no going back. They lived with the knowledge that the creeping death was always watching, always waiting. It followed them, even when they thought they were safe. It didn't matter where they went or how far they ran. It was always there, lurking in the corners of their minds, in the shadows of their lives. And they knew deep down that it would never stop hunting them. The creeping death didn't just take lives, it took souls. And once it had claimed you, it would never let go. One of the survivors, a woman named Ruth, had lived through the horrors of the woods and the cult, and she was one of the few who dared to speak about what had happened. She had seen it all: the Bloodbound, the sacrifices, the altar. She had seen the creeping death for what it truly was: a living, breathing entity that fed on fear and blood, a force that could not be stopped. She had run, just like the others, but she knew that running wasn't enough. No matter how far you went, no matter how much you tried to forget, the creeping death would always find you. Ruth spent her days in a small house on the outskirts of town, her eyes constantly scanning the shadows, her ears always listening for the faintest sound of movement. She had tried to leave Creek Hollow years ago, but the town had a pull on her, a pull she couldn't explain. It was as though the very land itself was tied to the creeping death, and as long as she remained within its reach, she could never truly escape. She had tried to warn others, to tell them what she had seen, but people didn't believe her. They thought she was just another crazy old woman, consumed by the fear of a past long gone. But Ruth knew the truth. The creeping death was real, and it would never stop. Her warnings were simple but dire. Stay away from the woods. Never follow the whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. And above all, never, under any circumstances, look into the eyes of the creeping death. She had seen it up close, those black, empty eyes that seemed to suck the very soul out of you. Once you looked into them, it was too late. The creeping death would mark you, and you would never be free. It didn't matter how far you ran or how much time passed. It would always be there, waiting. But no one really listened. Not until it was too late. The town, once again, began to forget. The whispers faded. The warnings were ignored, and the creeping death began to stir once more. It didn't take long for the first victim to disappear. A young man, curious about the stories, had gone into the woods alone. He had heard the whispers, followed the sounds, and like so many before him, he had disappeared. His body was never found, but those who knew better understood. The creeping death had claimed him. The darkness had returned. The few remaining survivors, those who had lived through the first wave of terror, gathered together again in secret. They knew what had to be done. They couldn't let the town fall into the same trap again. They couldn't let anyone else fall prey to the darkness that had taken so much from them. But even as they gathered, even as they tried to form a plan, they knew it was hopeless. The creeping death was not something that could be fought. It was not something that could be destroyed. It was an unstoppable force, an ancient evil that had been feeding on the blood and fear of the living for centuries. And no matter what they did, no matter how hard they fought, it would always come back. Ruth, now older and more worn by the weight of the years, knew this truth better than anyone. She had seen the creeping death claim countless souls, and she had seen it rise again and again, stronger each time. There was no escape. There was no way to stop it. The only thing they could do was survive. The only thing they could do was to stay hidden, stay away from the woods, and pray that the darkness would not find them. And so, the legend of the creeping death lived on. It haunted Kansas, a shadow that loomed over the town of Creek Hollow and all who knew its terrible secret. The survivors, too afraid to speak of it, passed on their warnings to those who would listen. Stay away from the woods. Don't follow the whispers, and never look into the eyes of the creeping death. It was always watching, and it would never stop.